Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Well, welcome to the official dog days of summer, right? Traffic is a little lighter, the pace is not as frenetic, and more sand is in our shoes. Thank you for supporting these last 25 years, the most widely watched source of Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris Woodiman. As we welcome those summer distractions and activities, what are the issues that still run on in the background? Well, John Hood and Otis Rawl will join the dialogue, and we hope you will hang with us.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, John Hood from the John William Pope Foundation, Otis Rawl of the Greater Lexington Chamber and Visitors Center.
Well, happy summer, gentlemen. Good to have you on the program.
Glad to be here.
This is great. So here we are. Summer doldrums. Odie, I'll start with you. What's going on that's important? The State House is out, General Assembly of North Carolina is out. Everyone's kind of scattered to the wind. We're all down at the beach or traveling. What's running in the background that's still pretty critical that we're not really paying attention to?
Well, in South Carolina, Chris, I think it's twofold. We came out of the primary elections a little bit surprised at a couple of folks that had gotten beat. Our judiciary chair in the Senate, which the business community depended on an awful lot, lost. The governor was involved with a bunch of election type initiatives. Her candidates didn't do really well. So we're kind of going into next session really wondering what the flavor of the day is going to be and how the debate's going to surround the governor and the Senate, particularly with the action that happened there. But I think the real issue for us right now is still the expansion of the port in South Carolina because of the number of manufacturing type jobs that we're creating, and then transportation, how we go get the goods and services from the port to our businesses and ultimately from the businesses back to the port in a global marketplace. So we got some money on the transportation side, about $2 billion this year to address some of our major weak links in our interstate system. But we still have a major problem that we've got to address from a transportation side in South Carolina.
John, what's running in the background for you think, in North
Carolina?
Well,
there's an important contrast between the two Carolinas here, because in North Carolina, of course, we have a governor's race. And it's not at all clear that the Republican governor, Pat McCrory, is going to be reelected. It's a highly competitive race. So there's a great deal of uncertainty about who's going to run the administration of the state, which is not the case in South Carolina at the moment. There are also, of course, other races on the ballot in North Carolina. 2 open seats that haven't been open in a very long time, the state treasurer's post and the state attorney general post, that are both very important and of great interest to business leaders in the state. The legislature is unlikely to dramatically change in a partisan way. Usually in a presidential year in North Carolina, you don't have as large a legislative swing. It's usually in the midterm election when the legislature might swing one way or the other. But the Democrats who were in power in Raleigh for more than a century and are suddenly in the last several years and very painfully out of power, they don't really expect to get much power back in the legislature this cycle, but they hope to get that governor's seat back. And what that means is that in North Carolina, every job announcement, every lack of a job announcement, every piece of news is heavily politicized. Both sides immediately try to spin it to their particular points of view. A lot of this is kind of insular, like North Carolina is the only place in the planet that matters, when we all know that the entire South is changing in ways that are not distinguishable from state to state. North and South Carolina actually have some very similar economic patterns. I think that's the overlay in North Carolina, in addition, of course, to the uncertainty about the national political situation and how that might affect the economy.
So let's go to that. You both so eloquently, and I want to come back to a couple things you said, but before we do that, so let's talk about the overlay of the national election rhetoric. You've got, of course, a possible Clinton administration, a possible Trump administration. Otis, how do you look at, I'd be surprised if Hillary carried South Carolina. But how do you look at whatever it looks like after November for South Carolina? Would it affect it one way or another?
I don't know if it really does. I think I don't want to say we're insulated, but our governor has done such a good job from an economic development standpoint and continues. If you look at the announcements that we're having, whether it's an expansion at BMW or Mercedes broke ground yesterday, Volvo's coming, two arrays there. I think South Carolina continues to be economically viable within the southeastern section of the country, and I think what's really encouraging is when you look at Pat McCrory, he wants to go find out what's happening in South Carolina. How are we doing what we're doing? And I think we just got to give a lot of credit to Governor Haley and to Bobby Hitt for bringing back our manufacturing economy, which is spinning off jobs all over the place in this state, and we've got a very low unemployment rate. And I don't know whether we've done this under a Democratic administration in Washington. So I don't think a Democratic change or Hillary winning in the election really changes that dynamic. The question is, our state went very strong for Trump. But I think there's a lot of questions out there. What's his economic policies going to look like? Are they going to change? We would think that they would be more progressive and favor businesses more, but that's still a question. The certainty is that we know what we've been dealing with the last 8 years with a Democratic administration, and we've done really well.
Is the acute nature of North Carolina being a swing state in the last election just as acute, if not more now?
Oh yes, it's one of the most tightly contested races or states in the presidential race this year. You will see Clinton and Trump into North Carolina multiple times for that very reason. Of course, Hillary Clinton doesn't need to win North Carolina. Trump absolutely needs to win North Carolina, so it's a higher priority for him. I think it's going to be a challenge for Trump. But as far as the economy is concerned, it seems to me that there is a great deal of, as Otis was just saying, there's clarity about what you're going to get out of a Clinton administration, and there's a lack of clarity about what might come from a Trump administration.
Isn't that ironic? Didn't it used to be the other way around between the Republicans and Democrats to some degree?
Uncertainty can be present on either side, but and that's certainly the case, but whether business would expect a friendlier treatment from a Democratic administration in Washington or a Republican one? No, recently that's been a pretty easy call for a lot of business people. I don't think this year it's quite the same. Again, they know what they would get from Clinton. In some areas they would be okay, in some areas they would be disappointed. But with Trump, for example, on the trade issue, remember that lots of Carolina businesses in North and South Carolina were affected by the expansion of trade in a negative way, but lots of businesses were positively affected. Export markets were opened up. There are lots of businesses in the Carolinas that thrive on international trade. And if Trump was to pursue a more protectionist line and Hillary Clinton was to return to her position, I don't know, 3 or 4 months ago or whatever it was, that was in favor of trade, that would be ironically a case where the business community would probably prefer her.
So as we talk political theory, if we could strip away the impact of whatever it looks like after November, one of those, and I'll call it a liability, but one of the liabilities of a political dialogue is that we don't move forward on things like education. But I would argue just as importantly is transportation, as we've heard over and over. Otis, you just talked about roads and bridges and infrastructure. So, John, I want to stay with you for a second. How critical is it that we get, and I say we in the region, that North Carolina gets a transportation plan funded right and the policy moving in the right direction? Well,
it's critically important, and just like South Carolina has done, North Carolina has recently significantly increased transportation funding. We went through a period where there was a lot of more or less inaction, but lots of worry about highway funding, both existing roads needing to be resurfaced or expanded and new capacity needing to be added. And in the last several years, North Carolina has added hundreds of millions of dollars a year in additional spending for roads. It's going to make a tremendous difference. Now, there's still a lot of unfunded needs. And the issue here, as we all know, is fundamentally a long-term technology problem. It's good news. Because cars get more miles to the gallon, we can get more off of a gallon of gas. We can drive more. The problem is if our revenue system is based on how many gallons of gas you buy, then you're going to collect less revenue per mile. This is a basic problem. You can't wish it away. You've got to solve it. The issue, though, is the solutions, as far as anybody can tell, are raise the motor fuels tax more, which is unpopular, or tax cars when you sell them, or every year when you register them more, which is unpopular, or toll new or added toll lanes, which is unpopular. Essentially, there isn't a popular solution. That doesn't mean there isn't a solution. You're just going to have to sell it.
Otis, and not to overplay this or to be overly dramatic on my part, would you say, and we're talking about this issue about transportation, would you say that transportation infrastructure, it's certainly important in South Carolina, would you say it's a crisis?
I don't know if it's a crisis yet, but the time frame that it's taken from getting to our coast to our upstate industrial areas and all, you come into Columbia anywhere around 3:30 to 6 o'clock and it's standstill. It's just a juggernaut around there. And I mean, we've got 3 or 4 places on I-26, I-77, I-95 even to some extent, and once you get up into 385, where our interstate systems are just not capable of handling the traffic we've got during the week. And even getting to the point from a tourism standpoint, Chris, that our roads are so congested that people can't get to our tourism areas and get out in a way. So we often worry about those folks that are coming north are going to be short-stopped in North Carolina or Virginia because of the transportation issues. So I think the impact of I-73 is a big issue. I think those thoroughfares that go from 95 down to our coastal areas are important. But the big thing is we've got to expand our interstate system, particularly I-26 to 6 lanes from Charleston all the way to Greenville, Spartanburg. Without question. Without question. I mean, that's the lifeblood of South Carolina. And if that doesn't happen, then we will continue to drag behind. And transportation is one of the most, might be the most important thing that businesses look at when they look to locate someplace.
Well, and I will tell you, not to interrupt you, but I will say educators offline will also agree that transportation could be at least as important, if not more important, because of the community building infrastructure argument. Well, John was ticking through some ideas, and he said, this is unpopular, this is unpopular, this is unpopular, and they all are. I'm wondering, Otis, and you've been in South Carolina politics and the business structure for many years. At what point do we stop worrying about building consensus and start to worry about just finding leadership that's willing to take the slings and arrows and take an idea and drive it home, no pun intended?
Well, I think the way our political system's set up now, and I've never been a person that believes in term limits, but I'm beginning to believe in term limits a lot more because people are so concerned about getting elected the next time they won't make the right decision from a policy standpoint. And if you narrow that time frame that they can serve, maybe we can get the right decisions out of our public policymakers. I just know that when we talk to people, when we go and say, we want to support you for a state seat, we want you to be remembered for what you did 20 years ago, not that you would be remembered for serving 20 years. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the psychology we've got to use, and I think that's how we got to think if we could be really progressive and do the things that we've got to do. Fortunately enough, because of what has happened to us economically, we've had some pretty good general fund dollar years in the last 2 or 3 years, and they've taken some of those dollars off and put it in some of the more critical areas that we need, public education and transportation. So our guys and ladies and governor are really working really hard to put the money in, prioritize what they've got. But if you look back to 2008, we've really not recovered from 2008 from a public education standpoint, from an infrastructure standpoint. And somewhere, we're going to have to take the gloves off and just fist fight to come up with a solution for education and transportation in South Carolina.
So same question, John. How do we get to a point of leadership, and not to say elitism, and it's not important to build consensus, but how do we know when not to build consensus and just to lead?
Well, leadership involves building enough support for your ideas that you can implement them. It doesn't mean that everybody is going to end up agreeing with your idea. You have to have a sufficient support. So taking a poll and recognizing that all the solutions to the transportation needs, other than doing nothing, by the way, doing nothing is also unpopular, because people are upset about traffic congestion and the economic development implications if you don't have adequate roadways and other transportation. So all of the choices have opposition, and in fact, many people hold contradictory views in their head. We all do. It's called cognitive dissonance. It occurs, and we try to flee it, emotionally in our head.
You're getting too academic.
Well, the point I'm making is
you.
that if you wanted to spend more on roads and you wanted to spend more on schools, but you don't want government to be any bigger than it is now, then basic math tells you have to spend less on something else.
Right.
So leadership, in my mind, in the scenario that we were just talking about in both Carolinas, because again, the challenges are quite similar, even the last couple of years, because of general fund revenue surpluses. In North Carolina also, they were able to essentially transfer some of that capacity to roads by getting rid of the diversion of funds that had come out of the highway fund to the general fund. So in a sense, that was what was done in North Carolina also. In this scenario, then, somebody has to argue that we're going to do the following 2 or 3 priorities, and we're not going to do all the other things that people want to do. Because you can't do everything that has a lobby, that has a constituency, unless you're going to raise taxes and make government a lot bigger, which in neither Carolina would be popular either.
And coming back with what John's saying, the real issue is education too. And if we're going to be successful, we got to move people.
K through 12 or education of the process of how things get done?
I think it's a process of pre-K all the way through adult learning. And the way jobs are changing almost annually, the training that goes along with that has to happen in our technical colleges and even in some of our 4-year universities. But I think the big issue, if any state's going to be progressive, we got to elevate those folks that are poorest to be able to get them jobs and get them on their own feet. And I think that's nationally, that's what's happening now. And to go look at the whole national issue, I mean, the $20 trillion debt that we've got, Chris, it's going to choke us here before too awfully long. And we've got to figure out how we're going to spend at the federal level, just as we're trying to be very conservative at the state level and look at entitlement programs, look at things at Social Security. And we're going to have to put these dollars in different types of programs that elevate the poor, educate the poor, and put them in, we really believe in South Carolina, in pre-K up to 8th grade programs, because that's where you get the biggest bang for your buck. If a kid can't read at 4th grade level, their chances of graduating high school diminishes greatly. So we got to figure out that part of our education system and how we're going to spend those dollars effectively there.
Were you going to say something?
Yes, I was, because you're making a really important point. I don't want to get too specifically partisan or political about this, simply to observe that if you look at North or South Carolina politics, no matter what you think those states should do, or you're a Democrat or a Republican, there's some fairly serious debates going on about the trade-offs. The national political debate is not presenting that serious challenge at all. Neither of the 2 major party candidates has anything of consequence to say about what Otis just said, that you can't spend on key priorities if most of the federal government becomes an entitlement state where you're just redistributing income because you're not investing in anything. Neither of the 2 major political parties has offered a candidate that is talking seriously about the federal debt, about the fact that the federal government can't afford to do its basic priorities if Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid continue to grow at their current rate. At least at the state level, governors and legislatures and others are actually having serious debates about these consequential matters of public investment, private investment, which is hurt when you raise taxes, and the basic delivery of goods by the state.
Well, so 2 questions come to mind here, John. So is how you describe it, is that the level, is that where the frustration grows from with people that have been backing Trump and Bernie Sanders? And then the second question is, will states end up being the incubators for whatever a new form of government, and I don't mean a not federalist form of government, but a new way of governing ourselves. You know, shorter terms, a different person, different profile of the person that gets elected. Is that what we're talking about here?
What worries me is the inactivity of Congress. I mean, what we've seen over the last 8 years is they've deferred the running of the federal government to the president. And what's happened is through executive orders, Congress is just delegating running the federal government to the president.
But Odie, people have said that all the time, that Congress doesn't do what they're supposed to do.
I understand that, but I think they've just vacated their responsibility more in the last 8 to 10 years, because you look, nothing has really come out of it. And what they do is keep pushing the programs down to the state level to let the state level solve the problems. I mean, they run out of money at the federal level, so where the problem's going to reside? At the state level. And there's a little bit of push down from the state level down to the local levels, because in my job as a local chamber guy now, we're seeing that our cities and counties are having to pick up more of the responsibility for the programs that used to be handled at the state level. The state level's having to pick up a lot more that's at the federal level because of just what can occur at the federal level. So, I mean, we're actually getting the government closer to home, and it actually means more now almost to elect good county and town officials than it is to elect folks in Washington.
I think that's right, and I think that's probably healthy. That is the original vision of American government, was for states and localities to have a significant role to play, and I think that's fine. Even if you disagree, even if you think that Washington is the only place where big problems can be solved, I hate to tell you this, but it isn't going to happen.
That's right.
They simply don't have any money. The only thing that you can start with in a priority as a new president and a new Congress in Washington is to cut spending, or maybe raise taxes, but in some way to balance the budget. After you do that and you start paying down the debt, then you can have serious conversations about whether we should spend more on this or spend more on that. But that's really the only thing we need Washington to do. It's not doing it. That's what we need them to do, is get their fiscal house in order. I think policy innovation, I think public capital investment, I think encouraging private capital investment, these are all tasks that basically states are left with because the federal government isn't going to do it, and they can't do it.
So we've got 2 minutes left. Is this the basis for the genesis of some of the conversation? And I know you've been engaged in convening conversations around policy and around forward movement, but will we see more of this? Will we see more local conversations to say, okay, how can we disagree how can we disagree agreeably and actually move the ball forward? Is that's
certainly what I'm trying to do. You know, when people get together across ideological lines, they sometimes think the point is to immediately focus on what you have in common, and that's important, but that's not enough. You also have to focus on what you don't have in common. It's okay to disagree and argue vociferously about positions. You shouldn't make it personal, but we can learn to disagree more effectively, just as we can learn to agree productively.
Thank you.
And I think that's the goal here.
Yeah, that's the word I was looking for.
And for South Carolina, I think we're a little bit different than North Carolina. I've always said there's only 300 or 400 decision makers in South Carolina. If we could all get them in the room.
You think there's that many?
Well, I would hope that they are when you look at the business executives.
And I'd say the same thing about North Carolina. I don't know if there's that many either.
And policy folks. If we could just get that group together and really talk about the issues, I think they could get resolved. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, maybe 20, 25 years ago, we probably had 15 or 20 policymakers that the Banking Association came and talked to the General Assembly, or if our utilities as a group came and talked. And there were some other groups too, but there was like 5 or 6 groups that came together and they said, this is what the policy of South Carolina looks like. They would talk to policymakers, and away we went. Now it's just so much debate around so many different issues, and there's so much noise that we never can put the blinders on long enough to find those 3 or 4 things that we've already talked about that will move our state forward.
Are you, in 10 seconds, are you encouraged we can get to it?
Yes.
Yes, and I think the new version will be more inclusive than the old version was.
Do you see more traction around these conversations besides just what you both are engaged in?
There is a tremendous hunger on the part of many people in the Carolinas and in the country to have grown-ups have grown-up conversations. They don't see it out of Washington. They just don't.
Well, Chris, from South Carolina's perspective, I think over the last 2 or 3 years, we've shown how we can come together as a state. Okay. On the other side, we're looking at North Carolina kind of going a different way right now.
Hopefully that pendulum will swing back.
That pendulum will swing.
Gentlemen, thank you. Get your feet in the sand somewhere and have a good summer.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for watching our program. Until next week, I'm Chris. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care, when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.